Hi, in this video we're going to be talking all about this, the Panasonic GH6, and why I got it for wildlife filmmaking. I've been using this camera for 18 months now, and I've used it to film everything from dragonflies, tiny spiders, to birds and deer. And over that time I've found lots of things I like about it, and I found a few things I'm not so keen on, and I'm going to run through them today, and I'll explain why, for me at least, it's the best option for filming wildlife. Well, first of all, it has a 25 megapixel sensor, which means you can shoot in up to 5.8K. Now, you might think I only need 4K or HD, but of course, if you've got more than 4K, that gives you room in editing to crop in, to stabilise in post, and of course, if you have that high resolution, you can always downscale to 4K, which can give you an even higher quality image. Now, this camera will let you film in 4K, HD, and a wide variety of different resolutions. But the larger sensor, when you're filming in 4K, has another advantage. The GH6, along with its predecessor, the GH5, has a pixel-to-pixel crop mode in 4K. Now, this crops the image down on the 25 megapixel sensor, down to the minimum number of pixels required to record in 4K. It gives you an extra 1.5 times magnification to work with, which is very useful for getting close into animals without losing depth of field with smaller subjects, or of course getting closer to distant or more wary subjects like birds and mammals. The GH6 is the top-end video camera in the Panasonic Micro Four Thirds range. That means the sensor has a 2 times crop factor. So a 300mm lens like this one becomes the equivalent of a 600mm on a 35mm camera. But it doesn't just give you more reach. If I use a 1:1 macro lens, that will give me the equivalent of a 2:1 macro lens using this camera when compared to a full frame camera. Another advantage of Micro Four Thirds is the effective bigger depth of field you get, which is very handy when you're filming creatures, especially close up. Because of the crop factor, you need a shorter focal length to get the same field of view as a full frame camera. That means you'll have double the depth of field with the same field of view to work with. Now, this can be very helpful when you're trying to track a moving subject for a video. And of course, the small sensor means faster readout speeds, which means there's less chance of having problems with rolling shutter. And I have to say, I've not really noticed any rolling shutter effects when I've been filming, even on fast moving subjects. The video quality is great as well. You can film up to 10-bit in 4K 422 codec, which is a pretty high quality codec. And there's a whole suite of different options you can choose with the video, different qualities, different bit rates, different codecs, and different formats to save in. And there's too much to go through now, but let's just say they've got most of the bases covered. But one of the main selling points to me for this camera was the high frame rate or slow motion video it can do. When you're shooting at full resolution, at 5.8K, you can go up to 30 frames a second. But if you drop down just to 5.7K, you can get 60 frames a second. And that will give you footage that is slowed down by 50% or half real time if you go down to 30 frames a second. If you go down to 24 frames a second, it's only 40% of real speed. But it's when you drop down to 4K that things get really interesting. You can shoot at 120 frames a second, which when you slow it down to 24 frames a second, it goes down to 1/5 of normal speed. Now, that can be really great for filming dragonflies in flight or birds moving around and stuff like that. And I've used that extensively, and I've got some really nice footage. This 120 frames per second at 4K is available on other cameras, but in many of those, the quality drops quite a bit by the time you get to 120 frames a second. And a lot of them will crop down the image on the sensor, so you don't get a full sensor readout. But that's not the case with this camera. The quality stays really nice and high, up to 120 frames a second. There is a very slight drop, but it's really not noticeable, especially if you get a nice quality, well-exposed shot. And there's no cropping on the image, unless of course you engage pixel-to-pixel mode. So you've got the option with this camera. The GH6 also has 12 stops of dynamic range, which is handy when you're outside and can't control the lighting levels. And there's also a dynamic range boost mode, which I haven't used that much, which will give you 13 stops of dynamic range. Now, at 240 frames per second, the maths is quite easy. You get 1/10 of normal speed. And if you push it up to 300 frames per second, you get 1/12 of normal speed. So the results of this can be quite spectacular. Here's some footage I've filmed. Now, obviously, this is only in HD. You're going to have to upscale it if you need 4K. And the quality is not quite there compared to normal HD. If you put it in a video enhancement program like Topaz Video AI, it does come out quite well, I find, and it's certainly good enough to use on YouTube and places like that. There's also the option of using ProRes, so if you use Apple, that could be very handy. And with an external recorder like one of the Ninjas, you can also shoot ProRes RAW. I do occasionally shoot ProRes, but it does kind of eat up the space a lot, so I only use it when I know I'm going to have to do a lot of editing to the footage I'm filming. Now, talking of external recorders, it does have a full-size HDMI 2.1 output, so you can record up to 4K 120 frames per second in RAW with a compatible external recorder. Having the Micro Four Thirds mount means this camera can use a wide selection of lenses, a lot of which are really beneficial for wildlife filmmaking. Now, for filming wildlife, you generally need as long a focal length as you can get. Now, obviously you have the 2x crop already, so whatever lens you use, it'll have double the effective focal length. So 300mm becomes a 600mm, which can be very useful. One thing you do have to be careful of though, is that if you use an Olympus lens on this Panasonic body, you don't have access to the dual image stabilisation. You only have the image stabilisation in the lens. And you also don't have the Panasonic DFD autofocus, you just have the standard contrast autofocus to use. But I do tend to use manual focus if I'm tracking a moving subject anyway, so that's not that big an issue. The lens I've used the camera most with in the past is this, the Olympus 300mm f4 prime, and I usually use it coupled with the 2x teleconverter, which gives me the equivalent of a 1200mm lens. Throw in the pixel to pixel mode and you end up with an 1800mm 4K setup. Now this is really handy for subjects that are a long way away, of course. That lens also focuses down to 1.15 meters. So it's really good for close-ups of large insects like dragonflies, butterflies and lizards. And even things like shield bugs and stuff that are about a centimetre or so long, you can get some nice footage of them moving around on the leaf. It's not very flexible using a prime lens. There isn't much you can do if you need to change your focus distance or want to get a range of shots. So I decided to get a zoom lens and I got this, the Panasonic 100 to 400mm. It's quite light and it's packed down really nice and small and gives lots of options with zooms. It also works better with the autofocus and of course you get the dual image stabilisation as well. And best of all, you can pick this up for like 600-700 quid second hand, so that's a good budget option. There's also the Olympus 100 to 400mm. I recently went to the other end of the spectrum and picked up the OM, formerly Olympus 150 to 400mm f4.5 zoom lens, which is kind of the ultimate telephoto lens on Micro Four Thirds, with a price to match, I'm afraid. With the built-in 1.25 teleconverter on that lens, you get 500mm, which is a 1000mm equivalent on Micro Four Thirds. Of course, you add in the 2x teleconverter and you end up with a 2000mm f11 lens. And if you use pixel to pixel mode or film in full resolution and crop down to HD, you can end up with the equivalent of 6000mm. And I've got a whole video about that, which you can follow the link to in the description of this video. And of course, if you want to shoot smaller subjects, you use a macro lens. And I found it works really well with this OM 90mm macro lens. The IS in the lens works really well. And you can see here I've got some nice footage chasing bee flies around some flowers. And of course there's a whole host of other lenses in the Micro Four Thirds mount. A whole load of wide angles too, Panasonic wide angles, some of which are optimised for use with video too, like the 9mm. And of course you've got the option of using an adapter to use Canon lenses and other mounts. I use a Canon Fit probe lens with a Metabone speed booster and it works really well. Now this is a camera that is optimised for making videos. However high bit rate, quality or frame rate you use, it will not overheat. I've seen lots of people test them online and it just runs until the battery dies or your memory card fills up. It does that partly because it has a built-in fan and it's not too noisy. You can hear it, but if you're recording outside anyway, it's not bothered my audio at all. And I've even been shooting it on a very hot 30-degree day in the bright sun, filming dragonflies at high speed, and I've had no issues with overheating. On the other end of the spectrum, I've had it out in the cold and the wet. It's fully waterproofed and it's perfectly fine. It's got a great EVF. It's nice and detailed and bright. The camera itself is great. I like the grip on it. It's quite a chunky camera, certainly for a Micro Four Thirds camera, but not overly big, not overly heavy. And it feels well built and solid, only plasticky in a couple of places. All the doors feel great. The cover for the HDMI is a bit rubbery, but it feels quite tough as well at the same time. It's not very solid, but it feels like it's going to last. And I like the way the buttons are laid out. Very customizable, of course. There's even a record button on the front, but I have that set up as a different function. And something I do need to talk about is this fabulous articulated screen on the back. And I can honestly say the articulating LCD screen is the best I've used. It's bright enough to use outside. Obviously, if it's really sunny and glary, you're going to struggle like any LCD. But the way it's articulated is great. You can just bring it out to 45 degrees to use the camera low down. And that feels really tough and strong like that. And you have the probably now standard selfie mode. And of course, fold it back the wrong way around if you want to protect the screen while it's on the camera's body. And I've used that screen a lot, especially when using stuff like my probe lens, where it's low down to the ground, and for whatever reason I can't get down low down to the ground. As I already mentioned, there's a full-size HDMI on the side. There's also a USB-C socket, and that can be used to either charge the camera or you can record to an external SSD. Other people point out is that you can't charge it and record to the external SSD if you need to do that, but I don't use an external SSD. One thing I should mention about the HDMI, although it's 2.1, so you can record quite high quality, there is a noticeable lag to it. It's not massive, but it could be enough if you're recording some fast action to not keep up. But if you turn the audio off, that does reduce the lag somewhat. And I learnt that tip from Red Frame Tech, who you should go follow on YouTube if you're not already, especially if you're shooting Panasonic. There's a mic input at the top, it records great audio, 24-bit, and I can get some great audio using my shotgun mic. And as standard, you've got all the custom modes at the top. I use them and have one set up for normal speed video, one set up for 120 frames 4K, and one set up for HD 240 frames per second. And then there's a custom mode 4 with 6 other custom modes you can put in there as well, which I have various settings for. You can use the custom mode to set video modes, which is something you cannot do with the Olympus OM1. Image stabilisation is great. It's mostly in lens when I'm using it because of the lenses I use, but when I have used it in body, it's been fine. I've seen lots of praise for it online in other videos too, so you don't have to worry there. It's probably one of the best image stabilisations you can get. Like all cameras, it does have its faults. Let's start with the autofocus. Well, let's be honest, it's not great. It's a bit sluggish, especially if I was using my 300mm and a 2x teleconverter at f8. It can hunt. It doesn't lock on all the time, especially if the light starts to drop, then you really start to struggle. But I tend to use manual focus, so it's not that big a deal breaker for me. Battery life. The battery does okay considering, you know, it's churning out 120 frames a second in 4K, but if you've got 2 batteries and you're out in the field all day, that might not be enough if you're giving it heavy use. I'm going to do a whole video on the solutions I've found to this. You either need more spare batteries, or you can use a power bank to top up the battery power. I've bought a small VMAP battery to get around the problem, but I have a couple of solutions which I'll cover in that video, which I'll put out soon. You can use the old GH5 batteries, but it does limit what video modes you can use. You can't use some of the high frame rates and high quality ones, so I don't advise doing that. But perhaps my biggest bugbear with this camera is the slight lag from when you press record and it's starting to record. Sometimes it can be a second or even up to 2-second delay between the moment you press the shutter and the moment it starts recording. And I've already mentioned the lag over HDMI and how turning the audio off can help with that. But that's still an issue, I think, that hopefully they'll solve in the next body. And I'll just make a note of one other drawback of this camera. If you look around online, you'll see lots of reports of banding problems which happen in low light, but I haven't experienced them myself, so I can't really say much about them. But overall, I've got no regrets buying this camera. In my mind, it was the best camera you could buy for under £2,000 for filming wildlife. Certainly if you want the high frame rates and slow motion footage that I wanted to get. So you might be thinking, should I get it? Well, if you're already the owner of Micro Four Thirds lenses, perhaps you already shoot Olympus or have an older Panasonic camera, I think it's a no-brainer, especially with the low price at the moment. I think I've seen it for sale for £1,300, which is a bit of a bargain considering what you're getting for your money. And from what I can see, it's the cheapest way to get 120 frames per second in 4K and 240 frames a second or 300 frames a second in HD. Now there are more expensive options that might be better for you, which have better autofocus and better low light performance because they've got larger sensors. And if you do shoot Micro Four Thirds, the G9 Mark II has just been announced, which has much better autofocus. Apparently it's better than the OM1s, according to some reviews. I've not tried one myself. The video options look fairly similar to the GH6. It doesn't have the cooling fan, but I don't know if there's been any overheating problems. I've not heard anything, but the camera's only just been released, so I'm sure we'll find out soon enough if there is problems. And it is a bit more expensive, but I think perhaps the main reason to hold off at the moment is there's lots of rumours about the GH7 coming out. But even if it is, it's a bargain at the moment, the GH6. But whatever the case, the GH6 is certainly a solid wildlife filmmaking camera. I've been very happy with it, and if you get one, I'm sure you will be too.